Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Baxley, Community Support Provider for Public Health and Human Services here in Cook County, Minnesota. Today's video I want to talk a little bit more about a topic we've covered before, which is grief and loss. Specifically today with a focus on mindfulness. If you're not familiar with the idea of mindfulness, it's a fancy word for describing being aware of what's happening for oneself. That's important in the work that we do because we can't help ourselves figure out what we need unless we know what's happening. And that means, on a basic level, if I'm hungry, I need to be able to know so I can feed myself. But it also is the same with emotions. So to dive into that, we're going to explore a few elements of grief and loss that is pulled from a theory developed by a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She talks about 5 distinct stages of grief and loss that include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We're going to focus on a few of those today. And as we do, I'd like to invite you to listen and reflect in a mindful way if you may be experiencing any of these specific elements of grief and loss. Though we typically talk about them in stages, it's important to remember that they affect everybody differently and they don't necessarily follow a specific pattern or a specific order. And sometimes you can move from one to the other over several days or even several hours. So let's dive in and focus on a few specific ones. The first one I'd like to talk about is denial, and many of us hear that term a lot. But in the context of grieving losses and experiencing pain, denial is super helpful because it can help us to minimize the overwhelming pain that we experience around a loss. As we process kind of the reality of our loss and what that may mean and changes that are happening, we're also trying to survive the emotional pain that goes along with that, especially when our reality has shifted so completely that it can be overwhelming. It can take our minds time to adjust to a new reality when loss occurs, especially if in that new reality we might find ourselves wondering how to move forward, and that's a lot of information to explore and a lot of painful imagery to process. So denial is an attempt to slow this whole process down and to take us through it one step at a time, rather than being overwhelmed with it all at once emotionally. So denial can be super helpful. It also can cause problems if I'm in a space of trying to slow down my own process with denial and somebody else isn't. It can be challenging to navigate that between myself and somebody else, but doesn't diminish the significance of how helpful it can be. Another element of grief and loss is the experience of anger after a loss. When we're all trying to adjust to a new reality, anger can feel like it allows us an emotional outlet for all of the overwhelming elements of that change. It tends to be more socially acceptable to get angry about something than to admit that we're scared. And in that way, it can feel less vulnerable towards other people's judgments or rejection when we're angry. Again, the downfall here is that having emotional outbursts and expressions of anger can also leave us isolated in our experience because we can be perceived by others as unapproachable, especially in moments when we really could benefit from other people's support and closeness, connection, and the reassurance that people can provide in our lives. So it serves a great purpose. It can be a dumping of emotions that can feel really purging, but it can also cut us off from a lot of people. So another element of grief and loss is depression. And again, it's another thing we hear a lot about. And in the context of grief, depression typically occurs when our imagination, our nervous system starts to calm down, and we start to look at the reality of a present situation in the context of extreme changes and loss. We start to feel more, have more clarity around what reality is starting to look like. And in that context, the loss becomes unavoidable. And for that space of depression, it can really look like a pulling inward as sadness can grow. It might look like finding myself retreating, being less sociable, reaching out less to others about what I'm going through, and a lot of withdrawing. Although this is a totally natural, again, stage of grief, just like denial and anger, dealing with depression, because it can make things even more challenging, it can be a really helpful phase of grief to get help with, especially because you may find yourself alone in that space. The last one I want to talk about is this thing called acceptance, and we've talked about that a lot here in our videos. And it's a powerful element of working through change. So acceptance, when we come to a place of acceptance, it's not that we no longer experience pain or we no longer are feeling lots of emotion, but it's that we're no longer resisting the reality of our situation and the way things have changed. We're not struggling to make it something different. It's almost like a tug of war. If I'm in a tug of war with change and I don't want it and I'm angry or I'm overwhelmed, acceptance is kind of just like dropping the rope. And it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the pain, but it can free us up to let go of those other emotional survival tactics that can be present, and allow us to problem solve, to be more engaged with our relationships and compromise within our community, and to care for ourselves in a way that really keeps us safe and allows us to take care of our family. So just in summary, if you're reflecting on these things, denial, anger, depression, even acceptance, if you're finding that any of these processes fit for you and they may be more than you are able to handle right now on your own, I want to invite you to reach out to a supportive person in your life. And if one isn't available to you, or you need a little bit more than what that person can provide, to encourage you to call the clinic to talk to a trusted professional here in our own community. And you can set up an appointment by calling 218-387-2330. Thanks for joining me today. It's really great to be on the journey with you as we all go deeper into our own experiences.